we started our Skillshare poll to you.
It's our first one?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, hi. There's a few of us here. Hey, Sam, you just joined.
Yay, Sam.
Sam, this will be way too basic for you, but it's great to have you here.
I'm just going to hang out.
Yeah, cool.
This is why you're here. You're hanging out, yes.
Okay, so we're doing a Skillshare today. The idea of the Skillshare was to help people dealing with content to get to know Jekyll, because we're using Jekyll a bit in open knowledge on some different projects, like the Open Data Handbook. We use it for the Labs blog. We use it on the Open Data Index. It's a very convenient tool to use. When I was planning the Skillshare, I realized that we don't really want to, at least for an initial Skillshare talking about publishing content with Jekyll, we're not actually talking about Jekyll, but we're talking about using GitHub as a publishing platform. And Jekyll is just one of the tools that we use as part of doing that. So I have actually changed the focus a little bit to talk a bit more about GitHub as a publishing platform rather than just Jekyll per se. I prepared a little presentation which I'm going to use to walk through. I put a link here in the chat.
Paul, you want to share your screen, maybe?
Yeah, I'm going to share screen in a minute.
Yay.
So we're going to basically, the idea is we're going to walk through this presentation. Not really as a presentation, I'll talk around the points and people should ask questions, but that'll just help us keep some core points in mind. And at the end, we're going to start to actually use GitHub and try and create some content, okay? So we'll see how it goes. Hopefully it goes smoothly. So I'm going to start sharing screen now and talk around the points that I made in the slides. And anyone should stop me at any time, okay, if they have questions or whatever. So, has everyone got my screen now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
So,
clear.
excellent. Okay, so the Skillshare was going to be about Jekyll, and now I'm calling it content management on GitHub. I think that there's some basic things that we clarify first in terms of why we'd even be doing content management on GitHub and not on platforms that many non-technical users know better, like WordPress. So first we're going to go over some points related to that. So in general, content management is for creating, editing, and publishing content, and having a system for presenting content. So everyone on this call knows that. Just building up the context. When you manage content, we can either run our own system using things that we know like WordPress, Drupal, or we can use a platform. These platforms are usually for blogging, like Tumblr. There are certain, in terms of having our own system, there are certain overheads, and that's what leads to using a system like Jekyll and GitHub. So, for example, running your own, whoa, that's probably really loud, someone's beeping outside. Okay, running your own server for WordPress, for example, has issues of security. WordPress sites get hacked a lot, have to run a server, costs time and money for people to maintain it, to pay for the hosting. So that's kind of a bit of the background on, that's how content management is kind of traditionally been done, using stuff like WordPress and running servers, using the admin of WordPress. Then that brings us to Jekyll.
The joy of living in Israel with all of the beeping around. Sorry.
Yeah, there's some crazy people out on the street. I don't know how much of it carries through to the Hangout, but okay. So Jekyll is what we call a static site generator. It's a way of creating a website for content that doesn't require a database. It was originally designed for blogging, like WordPress was originally designed for blogging, but it was made from the get-go by hackers so that they could blog in a style that was familiar to them, with tools that coders usually use. that's the origin of Jekyll, let's say. The idea was to have a simple system that doesn't require all the additional setup of databases and stuff like WordPress, and that suits the normal workflow of developers. So yeah, static site generator, no security, no maintenance cost, and very low cost in maintaining them. The use cases for a static site generator, like Jekyll, that brings us to kind of why open knowledge is using them, is when you have content that's really just read-only, or that's not regularly updated and changed, or that's not user content, so doesn't require people to log in and things to read it. There's some examples here. I will quickly have a look at them. Open Data Handbook we developed on Jekyll.
Paul, can you just explain a bit more what you mean about not regularly updated? Because the Open Data Handbook has got an area that people can update.
Sure. So updates on the Open Data Handbook are fairly contained. You know, like someone maybe fixes a spelling mistake, or someone adds a value story or something like that. But in general, when you look at the entire content of the website, it really, very little of it will change over time. So that could be opposed to something where, if you had something where people are generating new content all the time, like volumes and volumes of new content, or changing existing content in significant ways, then a more traditional content management system like WordPress may be better suited, where the data is stored in a database. But for use cases like the Open Data Handbook, the vast majority of that content will never change. So because of that, there are nice benefits to just having it stored in text files that don't require any additional servers and overhead. So when I say not regularly updated and changed, that's kind of what I mean, that most of the content there will stay the same for years to come. Is that a bit clearer?
Yeah, that's cool, thanks,
Yeah, okay. So yeah, the Open Data Handbook, which was recently released and has an amazing design from Sam. That's just a Jekyll site. There's many, many pages in here. Open Data Index is also a static site. It's not actually done on Jekyll, but it is served from GitHub pages. This is a website with something like 4,000 pages in it that just gets updated once a year, basically. So that's another great use case where just putting it on GitHub and serving it from there, it's kind of like we put it there and we forget about it until next year. And you can even do blogs with static website generators like Jekyll. Jekyll, like I said, was designed around blogs, and the Open Knowledge Labs website is a Jekyll blog. So there's some use cases for when you'd consider a static site generator like Jekyll. Okay, but yeah, Jekyll is made by hackers and for hackers, so a lot of the tooling, a lot of the way you would use it on your computer really assumes you're a developer. So using text editors and even the command line. So for us, the question is, how can we get the benefits of something like a static site generator, Jekyll being an example of that? The benefits being, like I said earlier, low maintenance, no security problems, but still have a reasonable workflow for content management. And that's where we come to GitHub, and that's why I'm basically framing this Skillshare as more about GitHub as a platform rather than Jekyll. GitHub has built-in support for building Jekyll sites, and also for any other type of static content that you have. GitHub provides an interface for doing collaboration. It's the main point of GitHub, is to collaborate around code. And GitHub hosts sites for free, which is obviously a nice value add, that we can put stuff there and it doesn't cost. GitHub for content management is open by default, so anything we publish there is by default open. Any website served from GitHub is accessible to anyone. GitHub's already part of the workflow for open knowledge and many similar organizations, so it makes sense to centralize more work around it. And yeah, all the things that I mentioned before, security and stuff. Security and setup and cost. So that brings us to the main the main issues. Like how does someone who doesn't write code understand GitHub and get value out of GitHub? Does anyone have any questions until here? It was a bit of a long introduction, but it's basically to set the understanding of why we're using something like Jekyll. Okay, no questions. Okay, so we want to understand GitHub. We want to understand it as content editors and not as developers. So there's a lot of lingo that we need to get our head around and demystify. So I'm going to go through some core concepts on GitHub and try and show how they're really just simple concepts that are given fancy names. It's really important to understand these concepts in order to use GitHub as a content management platform, but it's really important to demystify them and really understand that they represent really simple things that we know from editing content generally and from normal everyday life stuff. So a repository is basically the contents of a project, or you could even just say a repository is a project. So an example repository could be, I'm just going to go to one here. So that's the repository page, Open Data Handbook. It's just a project. You could think about it like a project. That's where all the content of the project is. A commit, when you start using GitHub to manage content, you're going to come across commit a lot, and really it just means save. Pull requests. Pull requests is probably the most important thing to understand and the most confusing thing for people who are not developers. All that a pull request is a request to say to someone, I've made changes to your content and I want you to put my changes into your version. It's kind of like on track changes in Word or when you track changes in Google Drive, where you're asking the owner of the content permission to include your changes with the main version. There's a lot of formality around pull requests, but that's essentially what it means. Let me make changes.
Can I just ask a quick question about pull requests? If you're just creating a site on your own and no one else is really involved, do you need to use pull requests?
Absolutely not. There's no need to use them whatsoever if you're just doing the site on your own. No. The mechanism of a pull request is basically to handle many people contributing to one thing, let's say, and to provide a kind of formal, structured way to manage such contribution, where many different people could be contributing even to the same file, or even if we got really specific, to the same paragraph in a file. But in many content cases, and specifically when you're working by yourself, there's just no use case. There's no compelling use case for a pull request. Does that help?
Yeah, cool. I just keep thinking maybe I should be using it, and then I can't come up with a reason, so I've been ignoring it. But that's good. I'm doing the right thing. And
that's for like your own. That's for your own sites. Like, have you tried to contribute to open knowledge sites like the Data Handbook or something? Or
yeah, I did. Yeah, that was fun.
And that was using pull requests, right?
Yeah. So I did use it. So I use it in other scenarios. Yeah.
And was it confusing? Like, did you understand what a pull request was before that, or?
I kind of get the concept. I guess I'm just not entirely sure about when I should kick one off.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's okay. So we're gonna actually use one a bit later. 5 or 10 minutes. We're gonna actually do it. So that's all you need to keep in mind, that it's just a request to merge changes. Fork is another kind of hard one. Basically, a fork, when used as a verb, you're just creating your own copy of a project. And a fork as a noun is your copy, or some copy of some project. You have to use forking, like even to create your own copy, you use a button on GitHub called fork, and we'll look at that soon. But it's really good to understand. It's important to understand that it's a really simple concept, but it's just called fork. Branch is less important to us now, and I'd say it's kind of hard to understand from a purely from a content management perspective, but I've given a basic definition of it here, but we shouldn't need to use that right now. So again, we're kind of trying to say why should we use GitHub for managing content, and why is GitHub even suitable for that? We made some points earlier that we're already on GitHub, and it fits kind of parts of our normal workflow on some projects, so it makes sense. But it's also important for, I think, for people who don't develop to understand that code, or the type of code that's stored on GitHub anyway, is just text. It's not something mysterious or different. All it is files that contain text. I just put an example here. This obviously, if you don't code, is hard to, you don't understand it, but at a fundamental level, all it is a text file with characters in it, just like any other content. The fact of that is what makes GitHub suitable to use for content. That is why it's even possible that we consider using GitHub as a content platform, because in essence, content and code are the same thing. Okay, so if we even think about how developers use GitHub, and we think about it without using the specialized terminology of GitHub, whoops, wait a sec, I lost. All that we're doing on GitHub is creating projects for our content, allowing other people to make copies of our content, accepting changes to our content from other people, and saving our own changes to our content. That's all that GitHub manages. It does that for code, and it can do that for content as well. The last thing we need to touch on before we actually try and use GitHub is Markdown. Markdown it's a markup language. It's a way of writing text that says certain things about the way the text should be formatted. It's very, very commonly used in lots of scenarios, but it is the main way that we'd be contributing content to a Jekyll site or any other static site. So there are a few things you need to understand with Markdown. You can actually go a really long way with just 3 characters, with just these few basic assumptions. The pound sign for headings, the asterisk for emphasis, and a middle dash for lists. Those 3, if you understand those 3 symbols, and then you understand that you're just writing content like you're writing an email, then you know a real lot about Markdown. Like you can do a lot of stuff with Markdown just with those 3 symbols. So there's also a link here to learn more about Markdown syntax, but in terms of contributing content to projects, those symbols will get you a long way. I gave an example here below that shows how Markdown almost fits in quite well with how we normally write plain text anyway, like how we might write an email. Not everyone uses stars and these symbols in their emails, but it shows that structurally it's very similar. It's not a big jump to go from like a plain text email to writing really basic Markdown. Okay, so that's a basic overview of what we need to know about why we'd use GitHub as a content publishing platform, and some basic understanding of how we would do it. Before we move on to actually trying to do it and be a bit more interactive, does anyone have any questions? Or is there anything that someone would like an answer to that I haven't covered or something? Okay. So now we're actually going to work. It'd be good if some people unmute, because we might have to talk a bit here and see how we go. It's a bit of an experiment, but you should go and log into GitHub now. I think everyone on the call should have a user. If you're watching the recording, then you should have a user on GitHub and go and log in. And the first thing we're going to do, just to get familiar with the interface of GitHub, is we're actually going to create a web page. We're not using Jekyll, but we're using some of GitHub's built-in features to create a web page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this process myself. And there's also steps here. You should try and follow these steps. The link is in the sidebar to this URL. You should follow these steps and try and create a web page as I do it, and I'll demonstrate on the user interface. So basically, when we create this will get us familiar with the core buttons and interactions on GitHub. So we create a new repository. Give it a description if we want. Okay, once we've created the repository, or the project as I said before, we need to go to the settings. Settings are down here. When we go to settings, there's a section here called GitHub Pages. And then there's a button, Launch Automatic Page Generator. You can click that. And we can give I've given a name test. We have a tagline. You can add anything you want there. Then we have a text area here. So I'm going to select this text and remove it. Now everyone should just write some text here. This will be the body of your web page. So, okay. Once you've filled out some content there, you've got a name and a tagline as well. And we're going to do continue to layouts. Across the top here, you've got a bunch of designs. You can just click one and then click Publish Page. Then you'll get this notice at the top of the page, which will tell you where your page has been published. You can grab that URL here. And this is the page that I just created. This has been served live now on the web. We performed a few steps, we added a bit of Markdown, and we have a website. That's not incredibly useful for how we use GitHub for content in open knowledge, but it was just to give an example of how you can use GitHub to create something and start publishing straight away. And how it's not altogether foreign and it's not altogether only understandable by developers. So now we're going to try something a bit more complex. Just can everyone just let me know if they're up to there and if they actually tried that?
Where do you find the URL that it publishes to?
Yeah, so after you've clicked publish,
yeah,
you should have this message at the top.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, it's quite.
I think I missed
this is
that
the
message.
URL. Can you see?
Yeah. What happens if you miss that message somehow?
So in that case, can you paste in the sidebar here? Can you paste your username, and then I can work it out for you. This is the one? Okay.
Yeah.
So now we should be able to do...
I think something I find really confusing with GitHub is the idea of having stuff on the web and on the desktop.
You're using the GitHub desktop tool?
No, I'm not. But I know that you're meant to have stuff on the desktop, aren't you?
Right now, like for this Skillshare, I thought about that. The problem, I tried to avoid talking about the desktop, and there's a reason, because if we go back to the roots of like Jekyll or something that I began with before, it really is designed for programmers, and it really only becomes useful as a content platform when it's combined with something like GitHub, because GitHub provides us the web interface to make actions, whereas if we're working locally, we definitely have to resort back to hardcore developer tools in most cases.
Yeah, that's good. I mean,
and that's quite frustrating, That's
I'd rather avoid anything on the desktop. But like, for example, I was trying to add an image earlier to something I was doing on GitHub, and I just couldn't figure out how to do it. And when I was looking all for the help pages and stuff, it kept saying about doing it on the desktop and adding it to your folders there. So
yeah.
I don't know, but I'd rather avoid desktop stuff and just do it.
Yeah, I think to add an image, the only way you could do it is adding to the desktop, and like doing it via the desktop, like. Moore and Sam, like I've sat with Moore quite a bit, but Sam also, you maybe have some input here. Like, do you guys use the command line a lot when you're working locally, or do you ever manage to just use other type of user interfaces like the GitHub app or SourceTree?
I use the GitHub app just because it's sometimes more comfortable than just to Git on the command line. But it's depend of your preferences and how much time you have to learn like command line, because Paul had to sit with me quite a while to get the command line working, and you can't do a lot of stuff also sometimes with the web app. You can't do Git upstream, so you can't update the repository, which is weird because you think they will. But it's mostly useful if you're not a very tech person to use the GitHub application.
Yeah, I find sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
I was going to ask where it was. Is that a link to it?
No, there's are you on a Mac or PC?
I'm on a Mac.
So if you go to mac.github.com, you can download the GitHub app. I don't like it because Moore hinted at it now, but it actually hides a lot of very useful functionality and things that you would actually need generally when you're collaborating on GitHub. So I find it more frustrating than useful. But then again, I use the command line, so I'm probably not a good indicator of that. There's an alternative application called SourceTree, which I've used quite extensively. But again, you're just really moving into developer territory, and I genuinely think that now, like at this point in time, the most useful way to use GitHub as a content publishing platform is just via the GitHub web interface, and just for doing things like editing text. And once we start talking about things like adding images and stuff, it becomes much harder to manage without development skills. So that's like a definite,
You do need to do it locally when it's become big, like the handbook, and then it's easier to do the changes locally on your computer, and then to submit them, to commit them back, and pull request them. So it's depend on how you prefer to work, but you can do all of the work specifically on the website. You don't have to do it locally. Depend on your preference and how much time you have to learn.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've just been creating a workaround by storing them somewhere and then linking to them. So yeah.
Well, actually, I do that as well. By the way, I don't put images into Git. I put stuff on my personal Dropbox and just link to it.
Okay.
I think it's a much better way to work in most cases. So,
Right. Okay. Cool.
you know, I do that, and you know, I'm quite comfortable with all of the hardcore aspects of Jekyll and stuff. So, yeah, it's good to host images elsewhere and just to have links. Sam, I'm wondering if you have any, if you're listening still, if you have any other input on specifically on this issue with working locally versus working from the web interface.
Yeah, as I just said in the chat, I use SourceTree. I do everything locally.
Is that a school bell?
No, it's someone outside. I don't know. It's some car going past outside. It could be anything from someone driving around collecting old furniture on the street to God knows what. But it's a car and they've just gone past. Anyway, the noise is gone. It's not an ice cream truck now. Sorry, Sam, can you continue?
Yeah,
Right at the end, yeah.
I was saying I use SourceTree just because I like to do everything locally, and I like the full functionality of Git because I'm kind of aware of Git in itself and how it works. But I don't particularly like using command line, so I find that a nice middle ground in that respect.
Yeah, I like SourceTree a lot, but I still think you're quite comfortable with, you can even use command line. I think it's really hard for someone who's just dealing with content to use it.
You really need to understand the concept of Git before that's any use to you, really. Which
yeah.
is in itself.
Yeah. Yeah. So definitely for this Skillshare anyway, the focus is on the UI and yeah, just working with content files that we can manipulate in the GitHub user interface over the web. So now, any more thoughts or questions, or shall we move on to the next little exercise? Okay, so the next part, so in the last step we just created like a basic web page using a built-in functionality that GitHub offers. It uses a bit of Markdown and stuff, but it's not a Jekyll website. And it's not something that we'd probably do in our normal content management flow, like for example working on stuff like the Open Data Handbook. So now we'll do something a bit closer to that experience. I've got some steps here. Basically, I've got some tasks, and we're just going to have to see how one or two people go with it. But first you should go to this URL. That is actually, that's the Jekyll code. That's the code that powers the presentation that I'm doing now. The one that I was sharing before.
Can you put it in the chat?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
Yeah, so it's here. So what we want to do, the goal is that everyone's going to create a fork of this presentation, of this Skillshare, and they're going to add themselves as a participant. And then it will show in the presentation if everything goes well. And if not, then let's see. So basically the steps are, you've gone to this URL. The first step we do is we make a copy of the project for ourselves by clicking fork. I'm going to have to fork it as open knowledge because it's my own repository that I'm copying. But I'm going to do the steps now, and she'll do something similar. So we fork as open knowledge, or as whoever your username is on GitHub. Okay. Then once the fork process, the copying process finishes, it redirects us to our copy of the code, our copy of the project. Now we want to add a new file. We want to add ourselves as a participant in the project. So what we do for the user interface is we go to the participants folder. There's a plus sign that I'm hovering on now. Create a new file here. Click that. And now we get an editor. And now we all need to add ourselves. So here we get a little bit technical with Jekyll. Jekyll has this idea, this concept called front matter, which is like tags and metadata for what we're adding. So here we're going to add three dashes, 3 hyphens for the start of the metadata, and then 3 for the end of the metadata. And we're going to add a tag. We're going to add here name, and someone add your name. So name Joe Blog. So a name, add your own name. We're also going to give the file a name. So here, Joe Blogs.md. So we've given the file a name. We've added what's called front matter with the name Joe Blogs. And now we write a short description.
What's MD?
Okay, 1 second. So MD, every file has an extension. Like in general, just in computer land, every file has an extension that says something about the type of file that it is. MD is just the extension, or the most common extension for Markdown files.
Okay.
So yeah, so this is just saying that this is a Markdown file, and this is, so that's good. So this part says that it's a Markdown file. This part is what tells Jekyll the basic metadata about this file, and that's got to be blocked off by those 3 dashes above and 3 dashes below. And then this part here underneath is just general content. It can be paragraphs and paragraphs worth of content, and it can all be in Markdown. So we'd want to maybe have an example that uses Markdown.
Paul,
Yes?
can you explain which metadata we can put in the Markdown?
Well, there's no, in this particular case right now, for this presentation, I'm using metadata called name. Okay. We could also, let me check what else I added. Possibly there's username as well. Yeah. Okay, let's also add username.
And also, can you explain in general why?
Yeah, I will. So I'm just I'll write here my username, and then I'll explain what I'm doing and what it is. So this is metadata about the page. This is can be used in various places throughout the code. Like when someone refers to this page, they can refer to a property called, like an attribute of the page called name, or an attribute of the page called username, and just get that value. So that's getting more towards like how we program with Jekyll. So I won't go into too much detail, but you can just think of this section as a set of data that talks about the page. So here I've added my name. I'm adding a username, which is my username on GitHub, and then a sentence about myself. Then once everyone has done that, as well as giving the file a name. Yeah, hello?
Yeah, I joined. Sorry, everything good?
Yeah, cool.
Okay, awesome.
Then we want to save the file. So what we've done is we've created a new file. You save in GitHub by what's called commit, but all we're doing is saving the file. So we're just going to click commit new file. And now we have a second file here. P-Walsh was what I originally had, and now I have Joe Blogs. Has everyone got to those steps?
Paul, can I just check? Are we adding this on the fork that we created?
Yeah, exactly. You're adding it on the fork that you created. Is that clear? Is everyone following until there? I'll take that as a yes. So now we want to create a pull request. We've created front matter, we've added a sentence, we've committed. The last step is to make a pull request. So if we remember, a pull request is that you're just going to ask the person who runs the project, which is me in this case, if you can add your changes back into the original version. So to do a pull request, you start by looking at your copy of the code. So in my case here, it's okfn GitHub content. I go here to pull requests, click new pull request. Now, there's lots of buttons here, there's lots of information. All that we want to focus on right now is clicking create pull request. And then create pull request again. I can already see that Joe and Mary have done that. Anyone else doing that? Okay.
Hey, Paul, I missed a step.
Yeah.
Where do I create the pull request?
Yeah, sure. Just 1 second. So you go to your repository.
Yeah.
Then you go to this button called this down in the right-hand side where it says pull requests.
Got it. Thanks.
And then you can click new pull request.
Thank you.
Let me know how that goes, and then when your one comes in, I'll do the next steps. Okay, as you can see, I've already got 2 pull requests, so I'm going to merge those. So this is kind of the final piece of the puzzle in working with content. I have some version of, I've got some content somewhere. Other people contribute to it. In order for their contributions to be considered back into the original, which is mine, they make a pull request. Now I look at the pull request and I merge them in. And this is just the process of me saying, okay, you may